So that was it. I also got interested in a lot of the kind of the atheist stuff then, from the 2000s, which would have been End of Faith, Sam Harris's book, and Richard Dawkins, obviously, the God Delusion. And my father gave me, he was quite a strong Christian as well, but he gave me The Blind Watchmaker, you know. Did he really realise what he was giving me? Maybe he did. I never got a chance to ask him that question. Fantastic book, Blind Watchmaker.
Easier to read than The Selfish Gene, anyway.
Yeah. Blind Watchmaker is an excellent book, you know. And there's loads of blogs now. There's Bad Astronomy, Fringa. There's tons of different stuff that I got interested in, and also a very good podcast called Skeptics Guide to the Universe, which I think is an excellent podcast. It's just a couple of American guys, mainly brothers, who do a weekly podcast and doing that for a couple of years. A lot of their stuff really is around, recent medical or recent kind of scientific achievements, astronomy or geological or medical or whatever. And they also bring in a little bit of skepticism as well, kind of, always kind of asking, is this claim real or is this something that is definitely worth pursuing? And, great debate, and it's something that I always listen to. And I've gone to a couple of different conferences as well, so I'm kind of getting into this big way. There's been the two TAM conferences in London, and there's been a QED conference as well, which takes place in Manchester every year, which we'll talk about later. It's one of very, very interesting conferences. And that was really that kind of environment that I was kind of, at one of those TAM conferences, the Skeptics in the Pub movement was starting off, so I was sitting there at the movement and at one of the conferences, and somebody said, you should think about getting something going in Cork. I say, well, let somebody else. I'm not really an activist sort of person, so let somebody else do it. But I had been doing one or two things at Blackrock Castle, and I then tweeted Claire in Blackrock Castle and said, what about a skeptics group in Cork, in Blackrock Castle? And she said, yeah, great idea, and she tweeted it to the world. So before I knew it, I was locked into this thing. And, I had to sort of come up with something pretty quickly. It's like, the kind of a random idea that had come from this conference. And we had our first meeting in November 2010 with, it was actually with Dylan Evans on alternative medicine. Talk on alternative medicine. I was expecting nobody to turn up at that meeting. I was going, this is going to be a really bad idea. But there was actually quite a few people turn up. It was about 18 or 19 people turned up at the meeting. And then we had other meetings. We had one on GM foods, and we had another one on moving statues that just it was an absolute hit. I don't know, people turn up everywhere and talk about moving statues. So I would want it's not I'm not a skeptic because I'm a particularly rational person. I don't think I'm any more rational than anybody else. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a particularly good engineer. I am an engineer by training or by my university degree, but I don't consider myself to be the best engineer in the world. I kind of left it as soon as I graduated. And I don't think you might get this impression of skeptics are very logical people. You know what I mean? They sit down and they question everything, and they're kind of not the best fun to have. That would be the kind of the stereotype. But I think that it's something that I was very, very interested in. Skeptics seem to be interested in really weird stuff. That's the thing that really probably makes us different to a lot of people who are talking about football or talking about, lots of stuff. It's just, a lot of skeptics that I know tend to be quite nerdy. They love kind of, they love kind of different things, weird stuff, and then it's really a question of whether it exists or not, So a lot of it was kind of circumstances and interests that got me into this thing. Pardon? Face, yeah, that's right. Yeah, somebody looking down on me. Yeah. It's something that I find really, really, I'm still very, very interested in it. Irrespective of anything, I find it very, very interesting. I think there's a lot of people doing some very, very good work who don't get half the recognition for it. Because some of the things that they say are very unpopular. But some people are doing some great stuff out there, and it is a bit of a wake-up call. So I suppose the question is what are skeptics? And there's a big thing, and it's something that's kind of hit me once or twice. Is that a lot of people think skeptics are just a bunch of cynics. That's probably one of the biggest things out there, is that a skeptic, we all just think everything's worthless, just everything's bullshit. No, they're comedians, skeptics. I think that we're, I don't necessarily subscribe to it, because I think a lot of people, when people are being cynical, sometimes they're not necessarily using that much evidence either for that. I'm not saying that we give cynics an awful lot of material, though. There's no doubt about that. We can burst, skeptics can burst a lot of, prized balloons, but I wouldn't necessarily call skeptics, and people who are interested in skepticism cynical, because, we are. It doesn't have to be a cynical exercise. I think you can get very cynical about lots of things, and have your reasons, because sometimes in cynicism you're taking a position straight away, and everything that you're talking about or you're seeing tends to agree with that position or that viewpoint. But I wouldn't necessarily think that skeptics would be necessarily like that. And the other thing as well that we get is, you're very close-minded. What's that famous thing we get hit on, the Shakespearean thing, there are more in heaven and earth than can be dreamt of in your philosophy, you know what I mean? And that's quite an interesting one, right? Because, it's like we have no appreciation for stuff beyond our nose, beyond reality. And it's like, people say that, there's much more to life, why don't you be a bit more open-minded? But if you were to believe everything, right? What they're saying is a really open-minded person has to believe everything, you know what I mean? And then they have to reconcile all the huge conflicts between, believing one thing and then believing its absolute opposite, which is what the world is about. So when somebody says that, you're very close-minded, what they're really saying is you don't believe me, you don't believe my particular way of looking at something, which is a very, it's not close-minded, it's just saying, because that particular person might believe that levitation exists, or that flowers are running behind that they can speak to you and all this kind of stuff. But you know what I mean? They're not necessarily too keen on people who are believing in other things, right? So I just think that it says more about them very often than it says about a skeptic. It's a bit of a non sequitur. There's a very simple thing. Skepticism really is doubt in the face of, often extraordinary claims. That's really where it comes down to. Just doubt and suspended belief in what are very often extraordinary claims. And it kind of comes to this kind of idea of, they call it epistemology. Kind of, how do you understand things? How do you know things? How can we know anything? This kind of big question, philosophical question. How can we know anything? And the original skeptics, I think, were people who basically said nothing was knowable. They just took this position that nothing was knowable. You couldn't know anything. It was too difficult to understand anything. And anybody who made a claim saying that this is true, the skeptics were at their neck, basically saying, well, you didn't think of that, you didn't think of this. And I think over the years it kind of became modified that, nothing is perfectly knowable, but some things are a little bit better knowable than others, Some claims are just a little bit worse than others are. And I don't think the idea really nowadays is that nothing is unknowable, everything is unknowable. I think what people are talking about now is that if you're to make a claim to reality, then there should be some sort of evidence to back it up. That's the bottom line. There should be something there, some evidence there to back it up. And if you're basically going, you're saying, well, there's no evidence, we've never really tried this before, we've never really done this before, that's fine. As long as you're honest about it. An awful lot of people make claims and they say, this exists, this particular phenomenon exists, or this particular phenomenon does not exist, and they don't back it up with evidence, proper evidence. And a lot of that is really where it comes to. And I think one of the other big things really is that science has been very, very good at putting in processes to try and know things as much as possible. But that's really the benefit of science. It's been able to take all of these claims and put them to the test. And it's been able to, very often put down very, very strict tests that are able to make us understand if something is unbalanced. It's really, really successful at it. Like, there's planes flying above us, there's satellites, there's medical procedures that are prolonging people's lives and helping babies to be born and all of this kind of stuff, because people have been able to distinguish the good ideas from the bad ideas. And that's really all we're saying. And I think probably the other thing as well that informs skepticism is a type of naturalism. It's kind of saying, we haven't seen the supernatural have very much influence in life over the last, in anything over the last, when it actually is put to the test. There's been no scientists who are kind of sitting together and saying, God, yeah. Yeah, that definitely was right on the paper. We haven't seen that many kind of peer-reviewed papers that says, well, we put all the tests, we have to conclude it was God. That's the kind of the bottom line. It's still one of those things that we're trying to, that it does inform the outlook, and it does inform the way.
So science couldn't work otherwise.
Sorry?
Science couldn't work without naturalism in it.
Yeah, that's it.
It has to be testable.
And everything that's the great thing. It's the fantastic thing about science is that if you put in the effort and you really put in the effort, you put in the years, sometimes centuries, into trying to figure something out, the answer is usually really quite wonderful, but not necessarily not supernatural, but really quite wonderful. And it's still a kind of an ongoing quest to try and dig deeper and understand, the underlying causes. But there are very, very few scientific papers that go, hey, we've tried everything. It's definitely God or the Buddha or something like that, and that's really the bottom line. And I think that's it. We're being asked to believe lots and lots of different things, and really, and it's just that there's loads of different people can come up with loads of different ideas. That they're great. It's great to come up with loads of different ideas. But the main thing is, can you test them against realities? How do we know that the world is round? How do we know it's not flat? It's not held up by infinite numbers of turtles? Those kind of things have been put that to the test, and we're able to figure out, this is actually the way things happen. And the other thing as well, I think, is the tendency people have of jumping to what are sometimes outrageous conclusions. And what I mean is that you see a light in the sky, and the immediate kind of thing is it's an alien civilization that has marched 500 light years from home in Earth. That's outrageous. What about it could have been a Chinese lantern, let's take off the more likely possibilities before you jump to something so outlandish as the idea of an ancient civilization jumping. There's all this kind of stuff that clouds, birds. People. A lot of scientists said they've been hugely fooled by flocks of birds. Just in a different situation, you see a very, very tight flock of birds, and they just get it all wrong in terms of the distance that the birds are away. And they think, God, what is that? I've just seen something really, really strange. Ghosts as well, all of this kind of stuff. You know what I mean? That people will see something strange, or hear sort of door closed, and they jump to this outrageous idea. You know what I mean? But it doesn't feel outrageous because we've heard it. It's so culturally embedded ideas. But when you actually think about it in terms of kind of logic, they are outrageous ideas, but they are culturally embedded, so they don't seem to be, and it's almost the default kind of reflection that people will say, oh yeah, it's definitely.
Didn't Carl mention the canals on Mars as being one of those issues where one scientist kept repeating saying that he saw canals on Mars through the telescope and nobody else could see it?
Yeah,
and yet it became a kind of a meme by itself, where people thought it must be there, and yet and it was just the light aspect. I think it was at the time. It was just the way it fell at the time he was looking at, and he couldn't repeat it. He couldn't prove it.
Yeah, but other people would then come up with their own different maps of Mars. And strange, lo and behold, none of the maps ever looked anywhere like each other. So yeah, and the alien stuff, the kind of big eyes, the aliens, and all of the. Very much kind of culturally embedded type of idea that it kind of goes to the heart of kind of what skepticism is. One of the other things as well is that I find I'm very interested in. I know a lot of skeptics are interested in a thing called logical fallacies, It's a logical fallacy is essentially a kind of a trick that people use to make you, not very often unconsciously, but it's a trick we all use to persuade each other of stuff, right? But sometimes it's a bad argument. It's just a bad argument. It's not necessarily not true, but it doesn't necessarily help your argument. It doesn't necessarily prove that your argument is true. And there's a couple of examples of logical fallacies. One would be an appeal to authority. So sometimes a dubious authority. So, it would be something like, because the Pope says angels exist, then angels must exist. It's as simple as that, right? It's because Penelope Cruz says ear candling works, then ear candling works. It's that kind of stuff, and it's kind of, and sometimes it can be quite a sophisticated argument, because sometimes there have been a couple of moon astronauts who have come back to the moon and have had some very, very interesting, strange ideas of the world. There have been some Nobel laureates who have won Nobel Prizes in physics and medicine who have also come up with some very, very strange ideas. And it's really a kind of like celebrity worship in some ways. If somebody says something, then it must be true. If Richard Dawkins says, X, then it must be true. If Enda Kenny says something, it's all that kind of stuff. It's literally just very, very much a default mode of the way we all work. Actually, we'll always kind of spend a little bit more time listening to what our parents tell us, or our grandparents tell us, or our best friends tell us, or our heroes tell us, and that is one of the things. But it doesn't necessarily. You then have to look at, well, what do they believe? The real question is, where are they coming from themselves? Because actually they could be wrong as well. Surprise, surprise. We're all human, and so that's one of the most common kind of logical fallacies. Is basically quoting somebody who you think should be the expert and should be able to answer everything, but may not necessarily be the experts any more than you might be. And the other one is the appeal to ignorance. And an appeal to ignorance is basically, because I don't know how it works, then it's impossible, it can't work. And the appeal to ignorance would be, because I don't understand how a monkey could possibly evolve into a human being, then evolution must not be true. And that's a very common one amongst the creationist community, is that they cannot conceive of any possible reason why, X, Y, Z, and it's just that they haven't read enough, they haven't studied enough, you know what I mean? You can't just throw it out and say, it's just a ridiculous argument. Sometimes ridiculous arguments in science are the ones that do work. It's rare, but it does happen. Other people, because I can't imagine how burning fossil fuels can cause climate change, you know what I mean? Then climate change does not exist. It's a real case of using a kind of an argument from incredulity or argument from ignorance. It's again not a great example. There's also, of course, the appeal to consequences. That's the next logical fallacy. An appeal to consequences, which basically says, if you don't accept what we say, a very bad thing will happen to you. It's called bullying. But it's essentially saying, putting peer pressure on people to. The Galileo thing, I think, would have been the great one, where Galileo had said, I think it's true that the Earth goes around the sun. The Catholic Church said, think about that one again. And Galileo then said, okay, it doesn't go around the sun. You know what I mean? But I think it might. But it's that kind of thing where sometimes the peer pressure can basically influence that. And the opposite, of course, of an appeal to consequences. An appeal is, if you believe this, then great things will happen. It's also called bribery. So one is called blackmail, the other one is called bribery. But again, they are common logical fallacies that are used sometimes to get people to change their views. Iraq, weapons of mass destruction would be one very good one. Weapons of destruction, mass destruction, do exist in Iraq. And if they, think carefully about how you're going to answer that question. Another one then, as well, is called a post hoc rationalization or post hoc fallacy, which says that if something happened before the event, then it must have caused the event. It's effectively saying, that taking a whole load of possible consequences and dismissing all of them and saying that one caused it. And it's a very common one in the whole vaccine story, which you're probably aware of, where my child got an injection and then they started showing the signs of autism, which is widely considered to be a post hoc fallacy. It doesn't necessarily follow that the vaccine caused the autism, but because it's kind of culturally embedded, or it's a very, very strong belief among certain people, it becomes accepted. And there's a lot of kind of things like that where, and that's the beauty sometimes of science, where you can take all of the possible causes and you can start considering each one in turn and trying to figure out, did that really happen? And is there a correlation between X and Y? Is there a correlation? And if there is a correlation, that doesn't necessarily mean that X caused Y. And can we actually go into looking at situations where X should have caused Y and it didn't happen? So those kind of things are also very, 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 very strong, very prevalent in society. And the other one, I mentioned Galileo, but there's also the Galileo gambit, which is, and it's the gambit of the crank. The person who's got this great crank idea, that they basically believe that, pigeons have caused, have caused, the international food crisis or whatever. Apparently, physicists, a lot of people, physicists and professors in physics department are often bombarded by papers from random members of the public, basically, completely denying relativity or, new theory of quantum mechanics, new theory, completely blowing away Newton. And they have this view that I am going to completely revolutionize thinking in this, and it's usually a straight, I'm sure they can fold it up into a paper plane, fire it at the dustbin. They get so many of them, right? And the Galileo gambit is saying, well, Galileo was proved wrong once, that all these great scientists, they had to fight the establishment, and they had to come up with their own. They were going to get this reaction from the establishment. And not kind of, and it's kind of, and it's in some ways kind of in a warped way, it proves they're right, because I'm getting this, because
conspiracy concept.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. And they become even more secure in their thoughts that they've come up with the great new idea but that's actually, again, it's a complete irrelevance. And there's the world is, is littered with people with bad ideas, mentality is the default position. And I think, so logical fallacies is one kind of big area that sometimes is hugely interesting, and it's hugely interesting to know how we can be fooled. The other thing as well is just, I suppose it's just psychology, it's just how our minds work, one of the great ways that we're influenced, and we're influenced by other people, is anecdotes. You hear an anecdote from somebody that you trust, or even you might have experienced it yourself. But it really is we're not great at. Our brains are quite biased, very, very biased, and we're influenced by stories, compelling stories. We'll often put more stake in a good story than we will a scientific study. How many of you, before you came here, read up the latest scientific papers on whatever, right? Most of you like to read a good book and a good story, and we're just born storytellers, and we love telling stories. And a story kind of almost by its nature just cuts away a lot of the stuff that really doesn't help the story. So a lot of the disconfirming stuff, a lot of the stuff that wouldn't necessarily help to be in the story, because it creates a bit of craziness and a bit of noise, and it's cut away. And as a result, when you hear anecdotes, you're hearing great stories. You're not hearing the stories of, all these websites of the alternative practitioner, the guy who's using mental force fields and kind of, helping to cure people's cancers. And there's a whole heap of anecdotes, Dad, I went to Mr. Flynn and he brought me through this, and 2 years later my cancer was completely restored. And you get all of these anecdotes. If you don't get the anecdotes that, I went to him and it didn't work, you know what I mean? It actually got worse. You know, where is that anecdote? I'm sorry, you know. You're going to look at where are the anecdotes that kind of, you know, that have been kind of completely excised. You know, that doesn't help this alternative practitioner to sell his stuff. So he's only going to put up the stuff that seems in some ways to help his cause.